Have you ever had one of those just really compelling but also kind of confusing philosophical ideas grab hold of you?
Oh, yeah.
Like maybe you've been thinking about power or freedom, those big ideas, or even the nature of society, and you kind of sense that there's got to be a more critical, a deeper way to understand it. You're looking for the right tool, the intellectual tools to really dissect it,
Yeah.
Well, that's what we're doing today.
Okay, cool.
We're going deep into the work of a thinker who wrestled with exactly these kinds of fundamental questions. Herbert Marcuse.
Yeah, Herbert Marcuse, born in 1898, he really became a central figure in 20th century thought, especially, during that kind of intellectual explosion of the 1960s.
60s.
Where his critiques of modern society really resonated. And it's interesting, he wasn't always comfortable with that guru of the new left label that some people tried to put on him.
Right.
But to really get him to understand his contributions, I think we need to understand his connection to the Frankfurt School. So this was this really influential group of thinkers. Formed in 1922, they faced exile during the Third Reich, and they really shaped, philosophical and socio-political thought in a really profound way.
They did. And for this deep dive, we're working with the entry on Marcuse from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Great source.
It's an amazing resource.
Yeah.
It covers the whole span of his life and thought, from his early work on aesthetics to his deep engagement with Marxism, his very unique perspectives on psychoanalysis and utopia. I mean, he really gets into the idea of one-dimensional thinking, which we'll talk about.
Oh, yeah.
He explores technology's role, the powerful idea of the Great Refusal, even his contributions to feminist thought. It's quite a range.
It is, yeah.
So for you, our philosophical listener, our mission today is to really dig into, excavate the core of Marcuse's intellectual journey.
Okay.
Identify those big, significant concepts and illuminate how his work kind of connects with all these central philosophical debates. So his dialogues with thinkers like Hegel, Heidegger, Freud, and Marx's development of what we know as critical theory.
Sounds good.
So let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
Take us back. Where does this intellectual journey begin for Marcuse?
Well, he was born in 1898 into actually quite a well-off Jewish family in Berlin.
Okay.
And initially his interests were in German literature.
Interesting.
But then World War I happened, and then the German Revolution.
Huge events, yeah.
Tumultuous times. And that really proved to be a major turning point for him.
Okay.
These events spurred him to really engage with Marxist thought, trying to make sense of, what was driving capitalism, what was behind the societal upheaval. He was really grappling with historical materialism and the possibilities for, radical change.
Right. So he's trying to understand these huge historical forces.
Absolutely.
But then his intellectual path takes this kind of unexpected turn.
Yeah.
Towards what we call fundamental ontology. After that initial foray into Marxism, he shifts his focus to philosophy. And a lot of this was driven by reading Heidegger's Being in Time.
Big book.
It is. And for someone so concerned with social and political transformation, making things better in the world, this move towards existential phenomenology might seem kind of strange.
It might seem a bit counterintuitive, yeah.
What sparked that change?
Well, so in the late 1920s, Marcuse goes to Freiburg to study with Heidegger.
Okay.
He encounters Husserl there, too. And this is when he starts trying to synthesize Marxism and phenomenology, which eventually became known as phenomenological Marxism.
Phenomenological Marxism. Interesting.
Yeah, and to understand why he did that, we need to consider the intellectual world of the early 20th century.
Okay.
So Marxist theory, while influential, it was facing some challenges.
Okay.
That proletarian revolution that Marx had predicted,
yeah,
it hadn't happened. It led to political setbacks. And even within Marxist circles, there was this concern about epistemological reductionism, this tendency toward a purely scientific deterministic view of history. And that seemed to downplay the role of human agency and consciousness.
Right. So there's more kind of mechanistic interpretation of Marxism.
Yeah.
With an emphasis on these so-called historical laws. It almost risks overlooking the subjective experiences, the conscious desire for change among the working class.
Yeah, exactly.
It almost becomes a theory that's unfolding to people rather than by them.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. And Marcuse was so committed to the possibility of real social transformation.
Yeah.
He saw this neglect of subjectivity as a real problem.
Okay.
He wanted to revitalize Marxism by bringing back the human element, the lived experience of alienation, and the potential for, conscious action.
Okay, so this is where Heidegger comes in.
This is where Heidegger comes in.
Okay.
He saw in both Marx and Heidegger the shared call for radical engagement against what they saw as inauthentic existence. For Marx, this was praxis, that revolutionary critical practical activity. And Marcuse initially thought that Heidegger's concept of Dasein.
Design.
Yeah, think of Dasein as Heidegger's term for this unique way that humans exist. We're always aware of our being and our possibilities.
Okay.
And Heidegger's call for authentic being, Marcuse thought that was a parallel radical response to the inauthentic conditions of modern life. He even believed that Heidegger's framework gave him tools to critique the reification that Marx described.
So wait, remind me, what is reification again?
Reification is this process where social relationships start to be treated as relationships between things.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, so he saw it as a way to understand how capitalism distorts human experience.
So for Marcuse at this point, Heidegger's examination of the structures of human existence, our way of being in the world, that could be used to understand how capitalist society distorts and alienates our being.
That was the idea. He saw Heidegger's critique of Vorhandenheit that's being present at hand, a more superficial way of being. He thought that aligned with this critique of reification. You know how oppressive conditions get in the way of real human self-realization.
Okay.
But that initial enthusiasm for Heidegger, it didn't last.
What happened?
Well, Marcuse became disillusioned. He felt that Heidegger was staying at this really abstract level.
Okay.
He wasn't really grappling with concrete social, historical, and political contexts.
Yeah.
The things that shape human experience.
This is where things get really interesting for us as philosophers.
Yeah.
I mean, Heidegger's exploring these fundamental modes of existence.
Mm-hmm.
Fallenness, anxiety being towards death.
Yeah.
But Marcuse realizes that these are experienced in totally different ways, depending on where you are in society.
Right.
Your class, your gender, your race.
Exactly.
Heidegger's Dasein, it was like a blank slate for Marcuse.
Right.
Devoid of the specifics of our social and biological realities.
Yeah.
Blind to these systems of oppression and domination that are actually shaping people's lives. Yeah, he was missing those real lived experiences of oppression
right.
and those daily struggles.
Yeah, and he really criticized Heidegger for this,
Yeah.
Like he said, he was focusing on an individual purged of the hidden and not so hidden injuries of their class, their work, their recreation. Heidegger's concept of just this anonymous, undifferentiated being, man.
Right.
It wasn't a good substitute for the messy, conflict-ridden reality of social life.
Yeah, life is messy.
Yes.
It's not just this abstract philosophical concept. So this disillusionment and then Heidegger's involvement with Nazism.
Yeah.
It led to a break between them in 1932.
Yeah, a decisive break.
And that same year, the 1844 manuscripts are published.
What a year.
You mentioned these were a huge deal for Marcuse.
They were.
What made them so important?
They were a revelation for him. They gave him exactly what he felt was missing in Heidegger.
Yeah.
A real, concrete philosophical anthropology, the tools to examine human nature within specific social and economic conditions. In these early writings, Marx goes deep into these philosophical categories.
Okay.
Labor objectification, alienation. He's building on Hegel's framework, but he's offering this really radical critique. And for Marcuse, these manuscripts, they were this crucial lens to understand how capitalism really distorts human essence.
Okay, so instead of seeing labor as this inherently self-formative activity, the way humans shape the world according to their needs and capabilities, Marx, in these early writings, he's describing how under capitalism, labor becomes alienating.
Right.
The worker is no longer experiencing their subjectivity in what they create.
Yeah.
They're becoming an object shaped by these external forces.
It's almost the opposite, right?
Yeah.
Instead of confirming their human potential, it becomes a source of enslavement.
Wow.
Yeah, this loss of connection to their own reality.
So powerful. So Marx's concept of alienation, as Marcuse finds it in these manuscripts, it's showing that inversion of the self-formative process.
Exactly.
The worker becomes this unessential thing.
Yeah, just a physical entity.
Engaged in abstract activity.
Yeah.
And the things they create become these alien things. Commodities that belong to someone else.
Right.
And this gave Marcuse a powerful way to understand the intolerable conditions of capitalism. and the need for that radical subjectivity that could see these conditions and reject them.
Exactly.
He was bridging philosophical understanding of human essence with the real, tangible realities of social and economic oppression.
Right.
This is the foundation for his own development of critical theory.
Yeah, it is.
And you mentioned his book, Reason and Revolution.
Yes.
So how does this engagement with both Hegel and Marx refine his thinking about social change?
Well, Reason and Revolution was published in 1941, and it was a big step in his thinking. And I think there are a few key parts of it that are really relevant to us as philosophers. First, he wanted to show how influential Hegel's dialectical thinking was on Marx's work.
Okay.
He wanted to challenge this idea that Hegel was just a conservative thinker. But maybe most importantly for us, the book really champions this Hegelian and Marxian idea of the dialectic,
Okay.
what Marcuse called negative thinking.
Negative thinking.
And he argued that this way of thinking, this critical engagement with contradictions, that was absolutely essential,
Okay.
especially in a world where the contradictions of society were becoming increasingly hidden.
Okay, so negative thinking is about revealing these hidden contradictions.
Yeah.
Can you give an example of what he meant by these contradictions?
So a big one for him was the contradiction of increasing national wealth while poverty persisted.
Okay, yeah.
The economic system generates this enormous wealth, yet so many people are left behind.
Right.
Negative thinking, or this dialectical approach, it doesn't just accept that, it questions it.
Yeah.
You know, like, why does this disparity exist when we have the potential to take care of everyone? It recognizes that gap between what is and what could be. And that involves understanding these two levels of negation.
Yep.
So there's negation one, which is
Yeah.
how the oppressive system negates human essence, freedom, and potential.
Okay.
And then there's negation two, which is the development of that critical revolutionary consciousness
Okay.
that seeks to negate those oppressive structures in turn,
Got it.
with the ultimate goal of achieving liberation. And this is really different from one-dimensional thinking
Right.
that he would later analyze, which tends to hide these contradictions and make them invisible.
Okay, so negative thinking is always probing.
Yeah, it has to be.
It's looking for those underlying tensions, those unrealized possibilities within a given system.
Exactly.
It's refusing to accept the status quo as natural or inevitable or even rational.
Right. It's about maintaining this critical distance, a different perspective, so you can see past those surface appearances.
Yeah.
And you can recognize those inherent contradictions and how human potential is being suppressed. And for Marcuse, that critical awareness wasn't just an intellectual exercise.
Right.
It was a prerequisite for any kind of real social transformation. But his exploration of liberation, it went beyond just political economy and dialectical thought.
Where else did he go?
He also went deep into psychoanalysis,
Okay.
especially the work of Freud.
This seems like another big shift.
It is.
How did Marcuse, after spending all this time with Hegel and Marx, how did he come to see psychoanalysis as this important tool for understanding society?
So psychoanalysis had actually been there under the surface in the Frankfurt School from the beginning.
Oh.
When Max Horkheimer took over, he brought in Erich Fromm from the psychoanalyst. They wanted to understand why the working class wasn't embracing revolutionary movements.
Interesting.
Marcuse really engaged with psychoanalysis more fully later on, especially in Eros and Civilization.
Okay.
And in that book, he's really taking on Freud's pretty pessimistic view of civilization. You know, that civilization is inherently repressive and caught in this endless conflict between the life and death instincts with no real escape.
Right, so Freud's not exactly optimistic,
No.
but Marcuse is trying to find the hope.
Yeah, he's trying to find emancipatory possibilities within Freud's own theory.
Okay.
He's arguing that our instincts aren't just fixed biological drives,
Okay.
but they're shaped by social and historical forces.
So he's challenging Freud's fatalism.
Yeah.
He's saying that if society shapes our instincts, then maybe changing society could lead to less repression.
Exactly. And he makes this crucial distinction between what he calls basic repression.
Yeah.
That's the necessary modifications to our instincts, you know, just to keep human life going in any society.
Right.
And surplus repression.
Surplus repression.
And that's the extra restrictions imposed by specific forms of social domination.
Okay.
Surplus repression molds our instincts according to what he calls the performance principle.
The performance principle.
And that represents the dominant form of the reality principle in a society,
Okay.
especially advanced capitalist societies.
So this performance principle ties back to his critique of capitalism.
It does.
How does he connect Freud's ideas about repression with Marx's analysis of capitalism?
Well, the performance principle is basically the principle of an acquisitive and antagonistic society.
Okay.
It's driven by this relentless need for economic expansion, and it demands that we channel all our libidinal energy, our desires for pleasure and connection, into alienated labor.
Okay.
Into work for a system we don't control. And yes, this work creates the means for survival, even leads to some improvements in living standards,
Right.
but it goes way beyond what's actually necessary for human fulfillment.
Right.
It's primarily driven by the logic of profit maximization
Right.
and the continuous expansion of the system itself. And that requires a lot of surplus repression, a lot of channeling and restriction of our desires.
Wow.
We're conditioned to desire what the system needs us to desire.
So it's not just our labor that's exploited.
Right.
It's our desires themselves.
Yeah.
They're being colonized to serve the system.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. It's this deeply internalized oppression.
And this leads to his concept of the ideology of scarcity.
Yeah.
He argues that in advanced industrial societies, scarcity isn't really a material problem anymore.
Right. We have the resources to meet everyone's basic needs and then some.
But the idea of scarcity is maintained.
Yeah.
It's used ideologically to justify this endless need for alienated labor and the unequal distribution of wealth.
It's a powerful tool to keep the system going.
It's really a powerful critique.
Yeah.
He's saying that we have the potential for a society with way less repression, more freedom and gratification. But the system driven by this performance principle and this manufactured ideology of scarcity, it keeps us locked in this cycle
Right.
of alienated labor and consumption.
Exactly.
But he doesn't stop there.
No.
He explores the possibility of something different.
He does.
So despite this bleak picture, he's still hopeful.
He is.
Yeah.
Especially in the later parts of Eros and Civilization.
Okay.
He turns to the power of fantasy and imagination
Okay.
as these essential spaces for envisioning a better world.
Okay.
And he argues for what he calls the rationality of gratification.
The rationality of gratification.
It's this potential fusion of logos reason and eros desire,
Okay.
where the pursuit of happiness and the fulfillment of our needs, they become central to how society is organized.
Wow.
It's a utopian vision
It is.
where the struggle for existence isn't about competition.
Yeah.
It's based on cooperation and the free development of human potential.
So this rationality of gratification.
Yeah.
It's a radical rethinking of progress and the good life.
Absolutely.
Moving away from just production and towards human flourishing.
Right.
And the satisfaction of our deepest needs.
Yeah.
But this utopian vision, it doesn't mean he thinks progress is automatic or easy.
No, not at all.
In One-Dimensional Man, which is probably his best-known work,
Mm-hmm.
he offers a more sobering analysis.
He does.
And the title itself, One-Dimensional Man,
Yeah.
it feels constricting.
It does.
It's like a flattening of human experience.
Yeah.
What is this democratic unfreedom he talks about right at the beginning?
It's this paradoxical situation where a society looks free and democratic.
Right.
You know, we have elections, we have civil liberties,
Right.
but it actually operates through these subtle but incredibly powerful mechanisms of control
Oh.
and social integration.
Mhm.
And these mechanisms lead to this widespread and often unconscious acceptance of the system, even when that system is oppressive and irrational.
Okay.
Marcuse argues that this creates one-dimensional thinking,
One-dimensional thinking.
which basically erodes our ability to think critically and to even recognize those power structures that shape our lives, let alone challenge them.
It's not about overt authoritarianism.
Right.
It's this more insidious control where people actually believe they're free,
Yeah, they really think they are.
but their thoughts and desires and actions are being shaped by the system. So what are some of these mechanisms of one-dimensional thinking?
He points to a few key things. First, there is this level of material comfort.
Okay.
He calls it this pacifying abundance of consumer goods and services.
Mm-hmm.
And that can really dull critical awareness. You know your content.
Right.
Then there's this pervasive sense of perceived freedom.
Okay.
You know, you can choose between all these different options,
Yeah.
but the options are all basically similar.
Right.
And it creates this illusion of autonomy. Then people start to identify with their oppressors.
Wow.
They internalize the values and goals, even the language of the system. And finally, real critical political discourse is marginalized.
Okay.
You don't see radical alternatives in the mainstream media. It creates this flattening of our intellectual and political horizons.
And this leads to his concept of repressive tolerance.
Yeah, which is a tricky one.
It is. How does this idea of tolerance being repressive fit into this?
Repressive tolerance is this situation where the principle of tolerance, which we usually see as good, essential for freedom,
Right.
it's actually used to suppress dissenting voices and to maintain the power of the dominant forces.
Okay.
Marcuse argued that in a society with such big inequalities, tolerating all viewpoints equally can actually reinforce those power structures.
Okay.
Because you're drowning out the marginalized perspectives.
Right.
And you're preventing real challenges to the status quo. It's this tolerance that, in its supposed neutrality, ends up tolerating the intolerable.
Wow.
It's not about saying all ideas are equal.
Right.
It's about how the principle of tolerance can be used to protect power imbalances.
It makes you think critically about these seemingly universal principles.
Yeah, it does.
Like tolerance.
Yeah.
And this analysis extends to his examination of technology.
Yes.
He makes this distinction between technology as a social process and techniques.
Yeah.
Which is the actual technical stuff.
Right.
He argues that technology isn't neutral.
Not at all.
The way we develop and use it is shaped by the system.
Yeah, by that capitalist performance principle.
So even though technology could be used to help people to create a more just world under capitalism, its development is driven by profit and control.
Yeah. The whole purpose of technology, its telos, is shaped by the dominant ideology. Even when it could serve really liberating goals, it's channeled in ways that just reinforce the existing structures of power.
So it's not enough to just develop new technology.
Right.
It's about the social and political context.
Exactly.
And this brings us to the specter of liberation and the great refusal,
Yeah.
which offer some hope.
Hmm.
What did he mean by these terms?
Even with this analysis of one-dimensional society, Marcuse was still hopeful about liberation.
Okay.
He saw this specter of liberation as always haunting these societies,
Okay.
a possibility for change arising from the contradictions within the system. And the Great Refusal, as he saw it in the movements of the 60s, was this powerful no to all forms of repression. And this wasn't just about class struggle anymore. It was this broader rejection of alienation, environmental destruction, war, wastefulness. People were tired of the way things were.
This feels more comprehensive.
Yeah.
Not just economic, but cultural, social, existential. And he talks about a new sensibility.
Yeah.
How does that relate to the great refusal?
Well, the new sensibility is crucial for overcoming these systems of domination.
Okay.
It's a change in our subjectivity, a move towards those life instincts, and new forms of interaction, less aggression, more empathy, cooperation, solidarity. He believed we needed this change to create a truly liberated society.
Not just changing power structures, but changing how we relate to each other in the world.
Exactly.
And this leads to his engagement with feminism.
Yeah.
It's notable that he saw the women's liberation movement as a potentially radical force for change.
He did.
What did he see there?
Well, he saw that it was challenging the very foundation of that performance principle.
Okay.
Questioning these masculine norms of aggression and competition. And advocating for this new sensibility, one that embraced care, nurturing cooperation. He even talked about androgyny as a future ideal.
Wow.
Hoping that rethinking gender could lead to a less violent, more humane society.
But I imagine there are some critiques of his views on feminism.
Oh, absolutely.
Wow.
Some people argue that he reinforced gender stereotypes and relied on essentialist ideas about feminine qualities.
So it's complicated. He's recognizing this potential, but maybe not fully escaping those essentialist traps.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for us as philosophers?
I think it's his commitment to critique.
Okay.
His refusal to accept things at face value, and his deep questioning of the relationship between our consciousness and these social structures. He brought together all these different traditions.
Yeah. Hegel, Marx, Freud, Heidegger.
To create this powerful lens for uncovering these often hidden mechanisms of power and domination, even in societies that claim to be free.
And his work is still so relevant today.
It is.
When we think about the impact of technology, the nature of freedom and control in our digital age, the role of culture and art and social change,
Absolutely.
the ongoing struggles for justice and liberation, Marcuse's concepts, they offer this really valuable framework for analysis and understanding.
They do.
Like, how can his idea of one-dimensional thinking help us understand the media landscape today?
Yeah.
Or how consumer culture shapes our desires?
Right. His work pushes us to examine how our thoughts and beliefs and desires are shaped by the systems we live in.
Yeah.
to question our freedoms, to look beyond the surface and see the power dynamics at play, to ask ourselves, how autonomous are we really?
So a final thought for a listener to ponder.
Okay.
Given Marcuse's analysis of one-dimensional thinking, how can philosophy itself avoid becoming complicit in these societal norms and assumptions?
That's a good question.
How can it become this force for critical awareness and exploring real alternatives? And considering his emphasis on developing a new sensibility, what role does cultivating our emotions and desires play in creating a more just and liberated society?
Yeah.
These are the kinds of questions that Marcuse's work raises.
It does.
And they're so important for anyone who's committed to philosophical understanding and engaging with the world.
They are.